Welcome to the debate.
It's good to be here.
We are looking at something today that is, well, it's frankly unsettling. I mean, this isn't some archival find from the 90s. This is happening theoretically right now.
Hmm.
Exactly. And the subject matter details a massive infrastructural project. They call it the grid shift. It talks about transitioning digital archives into cold storage, implementing something called narrative anchors, and completing a silent purge. But the central question this memo forces us to ask is not really about technology. It's about freedom. Are we looking at a necessary upgrade to save the internet, or are we looking at the architectural blueprints for a digital prison?
That is a heavy question. And I think the answer depends entirely on whether you view this through a political lens or an engineering lens. The document is incredibly dense with jargon. You see terms like silent purge, and you immediately think of, authoritarianism. I see that term and I wonder if it's just a clumsy description for garbage collection, for deleting dead data.
The clumsy description? I think you're being a bit too charitable there. The memo explicitly links this silent purge to a strategy of democratic recession via information scarcity. I mean, that is not engineering speak. That is a political doctrine. My reading of this is that this is a deliberate move to bifurcate the internet, to create a two-tier reality where the truth is locked away in a vault and the public is fed, essentially, a simulation.
And I'm going to have to push back on that right away. While the language is stark, democratic recession is a jarring phrase, I absolutely agree. We are very likely looking at a misunderstood technical strategy. We have to look at the context of the web in 2026. It is bloated, it is toxic, and in many ways it is failing. I would argue that the move to cold storage in these narrative anchors, well, they're responses to an infrastructural crisis, not a coup. We are potentially catastrophizing what is in effect a very strict librarian policy designed to keep the servers from melting down.
Okay, let's test that librarian theory, because I think it falls apart when you look at the specifics. The memo outlines a hard deadline, July 2026. That is when the grid shift occurs. The document states, quite clearly, that the internet will be bifurcated. One side is for the general public, and it's described as heavily curated by state-backed algorithms. The other side is the future file, which contains the original unedited web.
Correct. That's the proposed architecture.
To me, that is the definition of an information apartheid. You have a curated reality for the masses, controlled by the state, and then the raw truth locked in a vault that presumably only the architects can access. This isn't maintenance. This is the creation of a control mechanism. The future file isn't an archive for the people, it's a quarantine zone for history.
I see why you think that. I really do. Particularly given the phrase state-backed algorithms. That carries a lot of weight. But let me give you a different perspective on bifurcation and this so-called future file. We need to talk about why the web might need to be split in the first place. Are you familiar with the concept of bit rot or link rot?
I know that links break over time, of course.
Well, it's more than just broken links. It is the physical decay of the digital universe. Studies have shown that a massive percentage of the web from just 10 years ago is just gone. The servers were shut down, the companies went bankrupt, the data formats became obsolete, and on top of that, we have the exaflood, this exponential growth of data. We are generating more data every day than we have the energy to store.
So what you're saying is we are running out of room?
I'm saying we are running out of energy and reliability. If you leave the original unedited web on the live hot grid, it consumes massive amounts of electricity, and because it's unedited, it's full of malware, bot spam, just infinite loops of generated slime. My read is that the future file is a preservation measure. Cold storage is a standard industry term. It means moving data to a medium that doesn't require constant power, like magnetic tape or optical glass, and putting it in a vault.
Like a vault in a salt mine.
Exactly. So if they move the original web to the future file, they are saving it, they are freezing it so it doesn't rot. If they wanted to destroy history, they wouldn't build a complex future file architecture, they would just hit delete. The fact that they are building a specific architecture to hold the original web suggests a desire to preserve it, even if they can't afford to host it on the live, public-facing grid anymore.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. because it ignores the active component of the memo. It doesn't just say we are archiving old data to save power. It says the public side will be heavily curated, and then it explicitly mentions the goal, total democratic recession through information scarcity. You cannot reconcile preservation with a stated goal of reducing democracy by starving people of information.
That is the most difficult sentence in the text, I'll admit. Democratic recession. However, I come at it from a different way. We need to be precise about what democracy means in a technical context.
Democracy means the people have the power to choose and to know.
In a political context, yes. But in systems theory, democratization often refers to access and contribution rights. A recession of that democratization might just mean we're stepping back from the idea that every piece of data is equally valid and deserves equal bandwidth. Is it possible that democratic recession here doesn't mean the end of voting, but a reduction in the democratization of facts, meaning we stop pretending that a random blog post has the same weight as a peer-reviewed study?
That is an incredibly generous reading. You are essentially arguing that they're implementing an epistemic aristocracy, where the state decides what is true because the people can't be trusted with the unedited web.
I am not saying it's morally right. I am saying it might be the only way to stop the grid from collapsing under the weight of noise. If you have a signal-to-noise ratio that approaches 0, you don't have a web anymore. You have static. Information scarcity, restricting the flow, might be the only way to make the internet usable again. You restrict the flow to save the pipe.
Restricting the flow to save the pipe is one thing. Building a digital prison architecture, their words, not mine, is something else entirely. And this brings us to the first core point of our debate, the mechanics of this silent purge.
Okay, let's drill into that.
The memo calls it a silent purge. That adjective, silent, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. If this were a public utility upgrade, like, fixing a highway, there would be announcements, there would be a transition period where users could download their data. Instead, we have a silent purge leading up to July 2026. This implies that things are disappearing right now, and we aren't supposed to notice. The future file is described as the destination for the original, unedited web. By definition, that means the web left behind, the one we live in, is edited. It is a fabrication.
Okay, I think we need to be careful equating edited with fabricated. You're suggesting that curation equals lying. I am suggesting that edited might mean verified. Look, if the silent purge is removing dead links, bot farms, hazardous code, and illegal content, and then moving them to the future file for forensic analysis, then the silence is just back-end optimization. You don't announce every time you clean the server cache or update a spam filter.
We are not talking about spam filters. We are talking about the original web. That encompasses the entirety of human digital expression up to this point. If that is being moved to a restricted zone and the public is left with a curated version, we've effectively lost our history. The future file sounds less like a library and more like an evidence locker where the public isn't allowed to see the exhibits.
But consider the accessibility issue. Even on the original web today, can you actually find what you're looking for? Or are you fighting through SEO spam and AI-generated nonsense?
I can still look. That is the point. I have the agency to sift through the garbage to find the gem.
But for how long? If the cold storage argument holds up, the original web is dying anyway. Maybe the future file is the only way to save the truth. By freezing it, if you keep it hot, it degrades. By locking it in the future file, they preserve the integrity of the data against the entropy of the live web. It's like putting a rare manuscript in a climate-controlled vault versus leaving it out on a park bench.
But who has the key to the vault? That is the fundamental issue. If the future file preserves the truth, but I cannot access it, then for all practical purposes, the truth does not exist for me. And what replaces it? The memo says, state-backed algorithms. This brings me to the second major point of contention, the mechanism of control, specifically these narrative anchors.
Right. This is the section regarding the newsrooms, which I know you have strong feelings about.
I do. The memo notes a correlation between recent job cuts in U.S. newsrooms and the deployment of AI-driven narrative anchors. This, to me, is the most damning causal link in the document.
It suggests that the economic collapse of journalism wasn't just an accident. It was a prerequisite, or at least a convenient opening, for installing these anchors.
I see why you draw that line, but we do have to be careful with correlation. The job cuts in U.S. newsrooms are a well-documented economic reality. They're caused by advertising shifts, by corporate consolidation. That has been happening for 20 years. The memo notes the correlation. It doesn't necessarily claim credit for it.
It notes the correlation in the context of a project briefing. It implies, now that the journalists are gone, we can deploy the anchors. It reads like a predator waiting for the prey to be wounded.
Or it can imply, because the journalists are gone, we must deploy the anchors. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that this is some grand conspiracy to fire writers. I think it's a technical response to a vacuum. Think about it. If there are no human journalists to verify facts, the information ecosystem collapses. Rumors become facts in milliseconds. The narrative anchors might be AI systems designed to stabilize discourse, to prevent wild, unfounded rumors from causing panic. They anchor the narrative because there are no humans left to do it.
Stabilize discourse. That is a terrifying euphemism. If an AI is anchoring the narrative based on state-backed parameters, that is propaganda, pure and simple. It is the automation of the Ministry of Truth. You are removing the messy human element of journalism, which questions power, and replacing it with an algorithm designed to maintain information scarcity.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the alternative? We've seen what happens when there are no anchors. We've seen conspiracy theories tear institutions apart, lead to violence, lead to public health crises. If the goal is democratic recession, as you say, maybe the narrative anchors are designed to prevent the mob rule that emerges from totally unanchored, algorithmic social media. Maybe it's a safety rail?
A safety rail that walls us off from reality? You cannot have a benevolent tool that is explicitly designed for democratic recession. The memo says the goal is democratic recession. That is not a side effect. It is the objective. The narrative anchors are the guards in the digital prison. They make sure you don't think outside the allowed parameters.
I still struggle with the interpretation of recession there. In engineering, you dampen a signal to get a clearer picture. You reduce the noise.
You are describing censorship. Dampening the signal of dissent is censorship.
Is it censorship if the signal is just noise? If the signal is a bot farm in a basement somewhere trying to destabilize an election?
But the narrative anchor doesn't distinguish between a bot farm and a legitimate whistleblower. It just anchors to the state narrative. That is the fundamental flaw.
That is a fair criticism. The definition of truth in that anchor's code is the single most dangerous variable in this entire equation.
Which brings us to the urgency, the deadline, July 2026. This isn't some theoretical paper. This is a project with a launch date.
The July 2026 grid shift.
Exactly. This date represents a hard stop. The memo treats July 2026 as the moment of bifurcation. After this date, we live in the curated world, and the real world goes into the future file. This is the moment the door locks.
I have to question the feasibility of that date. July 2026 is right around the corner. To migrate the entire original, unedited web, we're talking exabytes of data, into cold storage and stand up a heavily curated public internet by July. That is a monumental engineering task. I suspect July 2026 is a milestone, perhaps for the start of the bifurcation, or the activation of the narrative anchors in key sectors.
The memo doesn't say start. It says by July 2026, the internet will be bifurcated. That sounds definitive. It implies the infrastructure is already in place. The silent purge has been happening. We are just waiting for the switch to flip.
But consider what grid shift implies. It implies a change in the underlying architecture, moving from a decentralized, chaotic web to a centralized, cold-stored model. That doesn't happen overnight. If July 2026 is the date, then the silent purge must be in its final stages right now.
Which is why it's silent. We haven't noticed because we are frogs in boiling water.
Or, again, to take the technical view, maybe the grid shift is simply the moment they stop supporting the legacy protocols. Like when they phase out 3G networks. The old web still exists, it's just in the future file, accessible perhaps via specific terminals or licenses, It might not be a prison wall. It might just be a compatibility break.
That is speculation. The memo says information scarcity. That implies access will not be granted. If I have to apply for a license to see the unedited web, I am not a free citizen. I am a subject asking for permission to know the truth. The grid shift is a fundamental alteration of the social contract. We agreed to give up our data for connection. Now they are taking the connection and keeping the data.
And I would argue that the social contract was already broken by the flood of disinformation. The grid shift might be the government or whoever is behind Project 2026 attempting to write a new contract, one where security and stability are valued over total access. It's a trade-off. You give up the chaotic freedom of the unedited web, and in exchange, you get a digital environment that doesn't collapse under its own weight.
You call it a trade-off. I call it a theft. They are stealing our history and selling us back a sanitized simulation.
But is a sanitized simulation worse than a toxic reality? That is the question the memo forces us to ask. If the unedited web is actually poisonous to democracy because of polarization, fake news, foreign interference, then maybe putting it in the future file is the only way to save the concept of democracy itself, even if it requires a temporary recession of the democratic process online.
You are twisting the logic to defend the indefensible. Destroying democracy to save it is the logic of every tyrant in history.
I am not defending it. I am trying to understand the engineering logic. Engineers fix problems. If the problem is too much information causing chaos, the engineering solution is reduce information. It's cold logic, yes, but it's not necessarily malice, it's optimization.
And that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Malice you can fight. Malice has a face. Optimization? Optimization just processes you. It turns you into a variable that needs to be solved.
That is a fair point. And it brings us back to the narrative anchors. If the system is optimized for stability, it will view dissent as instability.
Precisely. Dissent is a bug in the code, and the grid shift is the patch.
So where does that leave us?
It leaves us with a ticking clock. July 2026.
And a choice, I suppose, or perhaps the illusion of one. If this silent purge is already happening, the choice might have already been made for us.
So as we wrap this up, let's look at where we stand. We have a memo describing a silent purge, a digital prison architecture, and a future file designed to hold the real world while we live in a fake one.
And we have a document that could be describing a desperate attempt to archive a dying web into cold storage, to stabilize a collapsing news ecosystem with narrative anchors, and to manage a transition, a grid shift, before the entire infrastructure fails.
My position remains that the language reveals the intent. Democratic recession is not a bug, it is the feature. The future file is where the truth goes to die. If this grid shift happens in July 2026, we lose the ability to know what is real. We will be living in a state-approved hallucination.
And I maintain that while the risks are real, the digital prison might be a hyperbolized description of a necessary lifeboat. The future file could be the only place the truth survives. If we don't archive it in cold storage, we might lose it entirely to the noise. The grid shift might be a cage, or it might be a shelter.
A shelter you can't leave is a prison.
Or a bunker. Sometimes you need a bunker to survive the storm.
Regardless of how we defined it, the date is approaching. July 2026. The silent purge is likely already underway. The question for our listeners is, when the shift happens, will you even notice?
And perhaps more importantly, if the future file is locked away, what happens to the memories that don't make the cut? Who decides what is worth saving?
That is the question. Thank you for listening to The Debate.